Welcome to the Folkkeeper's Hearth, where timeless tales and ancient lore come alive. Gather round as we explore the myths, legends, and fables that have been passed down through the generations, keeping us connected to our ancestors and the old ways. Do you have your cup of tea? Have you pulled up a chair? It is time. Let us begin. The Heroes of Asgard, Chapter 2, Part 1b, The Trials in Utgard. The giant, however, did not turn back to answer, and Thor and his companions, after looking for some time after him, resumed their journey. Before the sun was quite high in the sky, they came out of the forest, and at noon they found themselves on a vast barren plain, where stood a great city, whose walls of dark, rough stone were so high that Thor had to bend his head quite far back to see the top of them. When they approached the entrance of this city, they found that the gates were closed and barred, but the space between the bars was so large that Thor passed through easily, and his companions followed him. The streets of the city were gloomy and still. They walked on for some time without meeting anyone, but at length they came to a very high building, of which the gates stood open. "Let us go in and see what is going on here," said Thor. And they went. After crossing the threshold, they found themselves in an immense banqueting hall. A table stretched from one end to the other of it. Stone thrones stood round the table, and on every throne sat a giant, each one, as Thor glanced round, appearing more grim and cold and stony than the rest. One among them sat on a raised seat, and appeared to be the chief, so to him Thor approached and paid his greetings. The giant chief just glanced at him, and without rising said in a somewhat careless manner, "It is, I think, a foolish custom to tease tired travelers with questions about their journey. I know without asking that you, little fellow, are Asa Thor. Perhaps, however, you may be in reality taller than you appear. And as it is a rule here that no one shall sit down to table till he has performed some worthy feat, let us hear what you and your followers are famed for, and in what way you choose to prove yourselves fit to sit down in the company of giants." At this speech, Loki, who had entered the hall cautiously behind Thor, pushed himself forward. "The feat for which I am most famed," he said, "is eating, and it is one which I am just now inclined to perform with right good will. Put food before me, and let me see if any of your followers can dispatch it as quickly as I can." "The feat you speak of is one by no means to be despised," said the king. "And there's one here who will be glad to try his powers against yours. Let Logi," he said to one of his followers, "be summoned to the hall." At this, a tall, thin, yellow-faced man approached, and a large trough of meat having been placed in the middle of the hall, Loki sat to work at one end, and Logi at the other, and they began to eat. I hope I shall never see anyone eat as they ate, but the giants all turned their slow-moving eyes to watch them, and in a few minutes they met in the middle of the trough. It seemed at first as if they had both eaten exactly the same quantity, but when the thing came to be examined into, it was found that Loki had, indeed, eaten up all the meat, but that Logi had also eaten the bones and the trough. Then the giants nodded their huge heads and determined that Loki was conquered. The king now turned to Thialfi and asked what he could do. "I was thought swift of foot among the youth of my own country," answered Thialfi, "and I will, if you please, try to run a race with anyone here." "You have chosen a noble sport indeed," said the king, "but you must be a good runner if you could beat him with whom I shall match you." Then he called a slender lad, Hugi by name, and the whole company left the hall, and going out by an opposite gate to that by which Thor had entered, they came out to an open space, which made a noble race ground. There the goal was fixed, and Thialfi and Hugi started off together. Thialfi ran fast as the reindeer which hears the wolves howling behind. But Hugi ran so much faster that, passing the goal, he turned round and met Thialfi halfway in the course. "Try again, Thialfi," cried the king. And Thialfi, once more taking his place, flew along the course with feet scarcely touching the ground, swiftly as an eagle when, from his mountain crag, he swoops on his prey in the valley. But with all his running, he was still a good bow shot from the goal when Hugi reached it. "You are certainly a good runner," said the king. "But if you mean to win, you must do a little better still than this. But perhaps you wish to surprise us all the more this third time." The third time, however, Thialfi was wearied, and though he did his best, Hugi, having reached the goal, turned and met him not far from the starting point. The giants again looked at each other, and declared that there was no need of further trial, for that Thialfi was conquered. It was now Asa Thor's turn, and all the company looked eagerly at him, while the Utgard king asked by what worthy feat he chose to distinguish himself. "I will try a drinking match with any of you," Thor said shortly, for, to tell the truth, he cared not to perform anything very grand in the company in which he found himself. King Utgard appeared pleased with this choice, and when the giants had resumed their seats in the hall, he ordered one of his servants to bring in his drinking cup, called the Cup of Penance, which it was his custom to make guests drain at a draught if they had broken any of the ancient rules of the hall. "There," he said, handing it to Thor. "We call it well drunk if a person empties it at a single draught. Some, indeed, take 2 to it, but the very puniest can manage it in 3. Thor looked into the cup. It appeared to him long, but not so very large after all, and being thirsty he put it to his lips and thought to make short work of it, and empty it at one good hearty pull. He drank, and put the cup down again. But instead of being empty, it was now just so full that it could be moved without danger of spilling. "Ha, ha! You are keeping all your strength for the second pull, I see," said Utgard, looking in. Without answering, Thor lifted the cup again and drank with all his might till his breath failed. But when he put down the cup, the liquor had only sunk down a little from the brim. "If you mean to take 3 draughts to it," said Utgard, "you are really leaving yourself a very unfair share for the last time. Look to yourself, Ving Thor, for if you do not acquit yourself better in other feats, we shall not think so much of you here, as they say the Aesir do in Asgard." At this speech Thor felt anger rise within him, and seizing the cup again, he drank a 3rd time, deeper and longer than he had yet done. But when he looked into the cup, he saw that a very small part only of its contents had disappeared. Weary and disappointed, he put the cup down, and said he would try no more to empty it. "It is pretty plain," said the king, looking round on the company, "that Asa Thor is by no means the kind of man we always supposed him to be." "Nay," said Thor, "I am willing to try another feat, and you yourselves shall choose what it shall be." "Well," said the king, "there is a game at which our children are used to play. A short time ago I dare not have named it to Asa Thor, but now I am curious to see how he will acquit himself in it. It is merely to lift my cat from the ground. A childish amusement, truly." As he spoke, a large grey cat sprang into the hall, and Thor, stooping forward, put his hand under it to lift it up. He tried gently at first, but by degrees he put forth all his strength, tugging and straining as he had never done before, but the utmost he could do was to raise one of the cat's paws a little way from the ground. "It is just as I thought," said King Utgard, looking round with a smile. "But we all are willing to allow that the cat is large, and Thor but a little fellow." "Little as you think me," cried Thor. "Who is there who will dare to wrestle with me in my anger?" "In truth," said the king, "I don't think there is anyone here who would choose to wrestle with you. But if wrestle you must, I will call in that old crone Elli. She has, in her time, laid low many a better man than Asa Thor has shown himself to be." The crone came. She was old, withered, and toothless, and Thor shrank from the thought of wrestling with her, but he had no choice. She threw her arms round him and drew him towards the ground, and the harder he tried to free himself, the tighter grew her grasp. They struggled long. Thor strove bravely, but a strange feeling of weakness and weariness came over him, and at length he tottered and fell down on one knee before her. At this sight all the giants laughed aloud, and Utgard, coming up, desired the old woman to leave the hall, and proclaimed that the trials were over. No one of his followers would now contend with Asa Thor, he said, and night was approaching. He then invited Thor and his companions to sit down at the table and spend the night with him as his guests. Thor, though feeling somewhat perplexed and mortified, accepted his invitation courteously, and showed by his agreeable behavior during the evening that he knew how to bear being bested without shame. In the morning, when Thor and his companions were leaving the city, the king himself accompanied them without the gates, and Thor, looking steadily at him when he turned to bid him farewell, perceived for the first time that he was the very same giant Skrymir with whom he had met in the forest. "Come now, Asa Thor," said the giant with a strange sort of smile on his face. "Tell me truly, before you go, how you think your journey has turned out, and whether or not I was right in saying that you would meet with stronger forces than yourself in Jotunheim." "I confess freely," answered Asa Thor, looking up without any false shame on his face, "that I have acquitted myself but humbly, and it grieves me, for I know that in Jotunheim henceforward it will be said that I am a man of little worth." "By the powers of the earth, no," cried the giant heartily. "Never should you have come into my city if I had known what a mighty one you truly are. And now that you are safely out of it, I will for once tell you plainly, Thor. All this time I have been deceiving you with shape-shifting and enchantments. When you met me in the forest and hurled Mjolnir at my head, I should have been crushed, had I not hidden behind a mountain, where your hammer struck with such force that 3 deep ravines were carved into the stone. These shall remain as valleys, a mark of your might. In the same way I beguiled you in the hall, when Loki and Logi sat before the trough. Loki indeed devoured as hunger itself, but Logi was wildfire, who consumed bones, trough, and all. Thialfi is fleet among men, but Hugi was my thought, and thought, as you know, can outpace any runner. As for you, Thor, when you drank from the horn, its end reached the sea itself, and you lessened the ocean. When you come to the shore, you shall see how far the tide has withdrawn, and men shall call it the ebb of Thor. Scarcely less wondrous was your feat with the cat. What seemed to you a simple house cat was in truth the Midgard serpent, who coils round the world. When you lifted its paw from the ground, we giants quailed, fearing you might heave the earth itself. And as for old Ellie, she was not a woman, but old age itself, and none, god nor mortal, can stand against her forever. You fought well, Thor, as few have. We must now part, and you had best not return here or try further against my city, for as long as I dwell here, I shall weave new spells to guard it." At these words, Thor raised Mjolnir, ready to challenge the giant anew. But before he could speak, Utgard vanished from his sight. Turning around, Thor found the city itself had disappeared, and he stood alone upon a wide, green plain as though it had never been. "What a fool I have been," said Asa Thor aloud, "to let myself be tricked by the craft of a mountain giant." No sooner had he spoken than a voice echoed from the sky above. "Thus do even the mightiest learn to measure their own strength. The journey to Jotunheim has taught you, Thor, as all such journeys teach those who walk the paths of Midgard." Thor spun round swiftly, seeking Skrymir behind him, but he saw no living shape, only a far-off mountain, whose cloud-crowned summit now seemed to stand closer than before, looming at the edge of the plain. Thank you for joining me for this Northern tale, based on the retellings found in the Heroes of Asgard by Annie and Eliza Keary, a public domain work first published in the 19th century. This is just the beginning of our journey through the old tales of the Aesir. We'll return to their stories in future episodes, weaving them in among other myths and legends from across the folk traditions of Northern Europe. Until next time, may the old ways guide you, and may the voices of our ancestors never fade.